Hello, scholars, and welcome to week 3 discussion. So, first off, hopefully you all realize you read one of my articles this semester, this week, and that one is called, I have my 2 copies here, Finding the Center Point, Decolonial and Indigenous Methodologies in Education Historical Research. And the beginning of that talks about why I named it Finding the Center Point, taking language from my grandmother who used to quilt a lot. And then we're also going to go over historiography from Philip Deloria. I also have my copy of that here. I'm going to, for this week, I'll be intertwining some of them because in my article, I actually summarize, in a sense, the historiography article. But first, I want us to start with terminology. So the first term I want us to think about is historiography. So essentially, that is writing about history. And all of these definitions, I'm going to give you like the real short version. So next word is epistemology. So the way I like to think about this is ways of thinking. So that's how I talk about epistemology. How are we thinking about thinking? And if you remember, Deloria describes it as how we know what we know. You also may hear indigenous epistemologies or indigenous ways of knowing. Those two, if you hear me say both of those are meaning the same thing. Another word that I just wanted to acknowledge is ontology, which is ways of being. So you have epistemology, which is ways of knowing, and then ontology, which is ways of being. So these words are actually ones I first came in contact with as a theology student. So you may or may not know I have a Master's of Divinity. So I was a theology student. It's a 3-year program, graduate program, and I was at Emory University. And so those are where I started to hear those words for the first time. So again, epistemology, ways of thinking and knowing, and ontology, ways of being. And in my theological context, I was thinking about how that relates to how we think about God and how we see God in the world and in our being, or our ethos, our way of being, our way of who we are. So again, I start with these readings along with the first ones from week 2 because I want us to be thinking about history and who writes about indigenous history, who writes and teaches about Black history, for example. And I wanted to give the example. We see how when Dr. Barlow got on the app that I won't name, but we know where we're all coming from. When Dr. Barlow got on her page and said, I'm going to teach Intro to African American Studies, and all of us not knowing that she was talking to her actual class, I think it's indicative of how many people wanted to hear about African American studies from an African American teacher, from a Black professor. And I say that because it was energizing to people to say, I want to hear this from this Black woman who is a professor and teaches this subject. And I think it's important because the reality is those who are teaching indigenous histories, those that are teaching Black histories, and those that are teaching other marginalized histories aren't always individuals from those communities. So I think it's powerful that we saw Dr. Barlow got on that app and said, I'm going to be doing this. And it's powerful because not a lot of people that look like her are teaching what she's teaching or are writing about the history that she's writing about. And I think we really have to sit with that and think about that. So in my article for this week, Finding the Center Point, you will see how I used Tulwa Smith, who we read last week, as I and other indigenous women in this article to lay the foundation for the article that you all read. So again, these history and epistemological questions are important because we have those questions of what knowledge is being shared with us, how is it classified, how do we understand knowledge for us, particularly in the United States and the scope of this class, and what refers to history and how history has been written and disseminated to us as folks growing up and living in the United States. So, and wanting us also to understand that For us in the United States, racialization and racial hierarchy is important in the history that we've come to know within the United States. And understanding that all of those are a result of settler colonialism. So again, that need to eradicate people, displace individuals, and have domination over others, which are all achieved under settler colonialization. So next I'll quickly talk about, because my article does discuss Eurocentric epistemology and indigenous epistemology. So again, Eurocentric epistemology, these concepts of compartmentalization, dividing things up. In our case, the United States, dividing people up when we talk about race, this development of race. There's also this idea, so again, Eurocentric ways of thinking, we have this idea of individualization, which again, we're removing the example from our settler colonial conversations is we're moving people from the land so that we can privatize the land and the land can be sold. And then we have this other idea of individual property. And for us in the United States, that includes the history of owning people as property. And Tula Smith discusses this, and also Deloria, who we talked about this week, when they talk about this ways of knowing that what is civilized and what is legitimate knowledge and history. So keep it in mind, that comes into play with a Eurocentric epistemological way of thinking about thinking. So by contrast, and what I discussed in my article, we have indigenous epistemology, which is upholding connections to soul, spirit, and self. And within these concepts of indigenous epistemology, the community is at the center, not the individual. Whereas in Eurocentric epistemology, the individual and that individualism is at the center of that knowledge. Also, as I point out in indigenous epistemology, there's the concept of how important the land is and how we can gather knowledge from the land and more than human entities on the land. So for us, that would be plants, animals, when I say more than human. So then I go on to discuss, why is this important to educational history? So why this indigenous and decolonial approach to history, and specifically educational history? So first, we have this critique of settler colonialization and its role in the displacement and enslavement of indigenous people and African people, which leads to boarding schools and day schools and the separation of children from their families, communities, and culture. This acknowledgement of settler colonialism also speaks to the history of racism, racialization, and racial hierarchy that was rooted in segregation broadly, but then specifically in schools, as I talk about in educational history. So I'm going to read a quote from Tula Smith that I have in my paper. And I printed this before it had the page numbers on it, but this quote is under epistemological clashes in educational history in that section, and it's the first block quote in that section. So Tula Smith says, coming to know the past has been part of the critical pedagogy of decolonization. To hold alternative histories is to hold alternative knowledges. Transforming our colonized views of our own history as written by the West, however, requires us to revisit site by site our history under Western eyes. And again, that's page 36 of Tula Smith. Now, in this quote, Tula Smith is talking specifically to indigenous scholars, but I contend this coming to know the past and transforming colonized views of history are important for all of us. And I would say that's why you all were drawn to this class, to start that unlearning and looking at those colonized views of history, particularly in the United States. So this is foundational to me as I discuss Lumbee education history. I must know how my people have been discussed or not discussed in history. Within my article, I summarize Delorio's work and give examples, or as I like to talk about, historical receipts of how this shows up in Lumbee archives and history. In Delorio's article, he's specifically talking about how indigenous communities have been discussed in history. But these are also similar ways that other marginalized groups are discussed, and how we see these are prevalent in historical narratives of other groups beyond indigenous communities. So again, I told you I was going to jump from my article and Deloria's article a little bit. So right now I'm going to summarize a little bit about the four stages of historiography or historical writing that Deloria talks about. And again, I summarize these in my article, but I'm going to do it probably even more quickly here in this video. So the first stage is the frontier stage. So again, we think back to the conversation we had last week about manifest destiny and how this language and idea of westward expansion and civilizing the Indians. So we see that in the historical writing that Deloria talks about within this frontier stage, when others are outside the community are writing about indigenous folks in history of the United States. We see that in their writing. So the second stage Deloria discusses is the racial or racial hierarchy stage. So keeping in mind, race is a social construct, but these ideas of race and race hierarchy have real consequences for how people are treated socially, politically, economically. And in my article, I give the example of McMillan, who is propped up as a hero for Lumbee people, but his writing about us shares his epistemological understanding of Indians as uncivilized and unintelligent. And so in my article, I give an example of how McMillan, again, our supposedly hero for the Lumbee people, he has come across some remains. And this is his quote from one of his books that he says, "The cranium found in these mounds are all Caucasian type and show greater intellectual development of those savage Indians." So he was talking about, because of the shape and the size of the brain, the cranium that was found, the skeletal remains, that it must be a Caucasian person. And again, this goes back to these ideas of biology that we discussed last week, how folks use eugenics, social Darwinism, and biology and other disciplines to say that there's a racial hierarchy. And we see this in McMillan's writing, how he's writing about us, the Lumbee who were in that area of Robeson County. So the third stage is the modernist period. So in this period, it speaks back to the frontier period, because again, there was this idea that the indigenous people are going to be won over. So in this modernist period, it's that indigenous people would be won over and that they would assimilate, and that there would be no more indigenous people and culture. And that's where Deloria mentioned salvage anthropology, which essentially was all these archaeologists and all these historians collecting all of these things. And this could be robbing, stealing these cultural items from tribes, and then placing them in museums or putting them in different collections and storing them. So that's what that salvage anthropology is, because they were salvaging things, because in their minds, indigenous folks would not be around later down the line in the future. So they had to take all of these items so that we would know about the indigenous people that had been killed off. So they were collecting all those things. And one thing I want to say about that, because I also, something that's important to me, is how tribes are getting back these cultural items that have been taken from them. And so I've been to a conference about repatriation, and someone was talking about how even when tribes are getting these items back, they have to be careful on how they're taking care of these items, because people have preserved them in toxic chemicals, a lot of times in pesticides, which are toxic. So that's another idea. We have this salvage anthropology that's going on. And not only do we have things that are still kept in museums and collections, but when folks are getting things back, they also have to think about this history and how people have tried to preserve these items and the reason for trying to preserve these items. So lastly, Deloria talks about this postmodern and post-colonial. And I don't really use these terms because I don't think we're in a post-colonial time. this idea that the goal was still to assimilate indigenous folks, and that to increase their moral and intellectual abilities. And again, this Americanization narrative. And I say again because I talk about that a lot. I don't think I've said that with you all, but I do talk about how the purpose of education, particularly for indigenous folks, was this Americanization and becoming better citizens or becoming good citizens. So, and in the example, in my writing I share, or in my article I share, that again, Macmillan, who's our hero, talks about how education served to elevate Indians' morality and intelligence. So again, there's this idea that indigenous folks need to be saved, and they need to be saved because they're not civilized, and that they're not educated, and you know, this displacement and this education is going to do that for them. And this education that's rooted in Eurocentric epistemology. So again, going back to my article and how I talk about Tua Smith says history is about power. And we see that in how Deloria has shared, and Tua Smith has shared, how history has been written, and even the examples that I give in Lumbee history. So this decolonial and indigenous approach seeks to rebalance that narrative. Deloria discusses, for example, on page 15, and how oral history has been not seen as legitimate ways of sharing knowledge. And in indigenous communities, sharing stories by elders and the communities and songs and indigenous languages are important in this ways of knowing for indigenous communities. And another example would be how sometimes if you're looking for Native American literature or history, it's labeled under folklore or folk history. So again, how this history and this language is important. And Deloria discusses this need for historical consciousness, which I continue to share in my research surrounding the Lumbee people. So I continue to do that, and how I discuss the invisibility of Black and Lumbee educational histories in the archives and in historical narratives, questioning the intentions of early schooling for Black and Indigenous communities and other communities that are marginalized in educational history. I also do this by expanding what is seen as legitimate historical narratives. And in the article, I discuss a little bit about how a lot of times colonial documents are seen as legitimate ways of sharing history. But as Tua Smith would remind us, artifacts, carvings, names, genealogies, and land are also important for sharing history. And finally, Jean O'Brien would share that language, culture, song, ceremony, and I always say that art as well is important to sharing history. That's it for this week's discussion. I look forward to hearing from you all in the comments. Don't forget to tell your friends. Come back, subscribe, hit that notification so you know when I've dropped that next video. See y'all later.